Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires to talk about Kislev. Obviously we have gotten a fairly solid rework with 6.1. The question is, would there be more that Creative Assembly can do for Kislev? Well, there's always more that you could do. Question is it realistic? There's various aspects to talk about this. I certainly think at a minimum that Creative Assembly should at least do a balance pass for some of the campaign mechanics they introduced in 6.1. By the way, I hope you enjoyed that little bit of art that I made using Gestalt and Katrin, Boris Ursus using ChatGPT. But anyway, let's actually dive into the details of what Creative Assembly could do with Kislev and what I would certainly hope that they do tackle. Well, one of the first things that I do believe they should address would be a question of balancing, because right now they've introduced a whole number of mechanics and additions to Kislev in Warhammer 3, but the issue is the balancing is pretty crazy in more ways than one. To explain that specific situation, for instance, you have the entire system of invocations on both a province level and an army level. But this system of invocations is kind of pointless to use. Legend of Total War made a video on the subject of Kislev just today, and he was right in saying that you would never use invocations or very rarely use invocations in a campaign, because in a Kislev campaign, especially on legendary, but even on lower difficulties, even if you're playing on normal, you're still going to be dealing with a minus 12 devotion penalty as you increase that devotion level. And you do want to increase that devotion level because it nullifies climate penalties. So you have this kind of system where if you're playing on higher difficulties, especially but on any difficulty, you end up not really utilizing it. One, you don't want to utilize it because you generally, where you would want to use it in the frontline settlements, they would probably not have the best climate. Because you do have the Chaos Wasteland, you do have the Wasteland if you're playing Katrin and Gestalten, you would want to get this up to a high level. And even if you do get it up to a high level and you don't have to worry about climate, you're only really going to use it once or twice for something like Dash. Everything else is pretty meaningless. I have played multiple Kislev campaigns as various legendary lords since the patch. It is principally fluff. And the army benefits are even less useful. Yes, you can get like campaign movement range, bitterness of winters, wrath of the bear, etc. But again, it is not necessarily a great system. I think it would be great to be able to use invocations regardless of devotion level, as long as obviously you're not going to minus 100. And maybe they could lower the cost of them to 25 devotion as well. That is just my perspective, would certainly make them more usable. They could keep the climate penalty removal, obviously at a very high level of devotion, so you'd still have a reason to get a high level of devotion. Though maybe not keep that situation at just devoted to over 75. Instead, maybe 50 to 75, that's where they could introduce the climate penalty. There could be some benefits so I would allow these to be used on any level. That would be my perspective on it. And they could just give some, stronger benefits for invocations, like make them better if you're at a higher level. You could argue that it is giving Kislev more power, but keep in mind it is power that takes build-up. And due to the nature of Kislev campaigns, all of them, including Astankia, you are encouraged heavily to invest in the early game. That is another aspect. Legend did touch on this. I'm not sure I agree with Legend on multiple levels. Like, he talks about Kossars and Kislev warriors. Personally, I use a lot of armor Kossars early on. I can get them. I can afford to get them. I do want to get to tier 2, right? And I rely on post-battle loot. Like, you get the armor Kossars, and then you rely on post-battle loot to get to going. Like, this is a turn 34 campaign. Sure, I did confederate all of Kislev over here as Boris Ursus, but I did also recruit a fair amount of units over here, even in some of the worst climate. The mistake I made in this campaign is that I didn't wipe out Archeon. Instead, I went for the Demon Prince. Well, he's basically dead. He is dead. But there is a price that I've paid for that. Like, my initial province got pretty much wiped out. And yeah, that is the penalty. But I did make it work. Just consequences for some of the decisions I did decide to make on that subject. With respect to other things that I would talk about in a Kislev campaign from a balancing perspective, let's just consider a balancing perspective. The supporter system improvement is very significant. However, it is not great to have a campaign as either Kastaltin or Katrin, simply because if you're playing Kastaltin or Katrin, you're just going to end up in that kind of dynamic in your campaign where you're not going to gain as many supporters as Estancia or as many supporters as Boris Ursus. That's primarily because if you're playing Katrin, you can gain supporters for battles against chaos, but you can't gain supporters for the Orthodox. You can only gain them for Dark Court by battles against chaos. I think like that kind of dynamic is not great. I think like it would make sense if Katrin and Kastaltin gained more supporters for their respective factions, so you would have battles against chaos, and also, you know, you would have this effect of battle against Ice Court enemies inherently because you are the Ice Court. I think that would be great. I also think it would be great if you could get these supporters if you say confederate, like battles against Ice Court enemies, if you confederated the Ice Court. Yes, it would give you a lot of supporters, fair enough. But it would incentivize you to not just herd cats when you can confederate them. So maybe a system of better military alliances would be in order in general with the game. But then you run into the issue, especially against Kislev, where controlling more territory is inherently beneficial to you, especially because of the landmarks that all the special Kislevite cities do have. So if you're not confederating Katrin and Kastaltin as quickly as you can, even confederating each other, then you actually end up in a worse situation in your campaign. You will lose power. So you might gain less supporters, but you will ultimately in the long term lose power in your campaign. Partly because of landmarks, partly because of atamans, partly because of their Legendary Lord skill lines. Well, Kastaltin's skill line more so than Katrin, because Kastaltin does have this amazing skill line that gives you Patriarch recruitment in all provinces, and that is fairly powerful. But both Katrin and Kastaltin also allow for greater tier differences with their respected factions, so either Ice Court or Orthodoxy. Another thing to mention in terms of balancing, yes, Katrin does need a better skill line, because her special skill line, her lord effects, her combat ability does leave, well, a lot to be desired. Like, for instance, over here, I reskilled Katrin, and I'm not going to spend a single point in magic on her. Why would I? Like, yes, I don't have a Frost Maiden right here in her army. I can't afford that from a capacity standpoint, but I do have a Hag Witch. So why would I spend points on magic with Katrin? Her magic is not better than what you can get from a generic lord or hero. In fact, if I wanted magic for Katrin over here, the best strategy would be to actually get an Ice Witch Lord over here and utilize that kind of magical potential that they do have. So just worth pointing all of that out with regards to how Kislev operates on the campaign map, the kind of situations you will have to deal with over there. So yeah, balancing wise, there's also things in the research tree, but one of the more substantial things I would say in terms of like unit balancing, it would actually be Little Groms. If Little Groms would actually be a tier 3 unit as opposed to a tier 4 unit, yes, they are a good artillery unit. That's never been the problem with them. It's the availability of them. Because regardless of how fast or slow you play a Kislev campaign, the significant portion of it is always going to be early on. You want this structure, you want this unit, but you almost never get it when it's actually meaningful in a campaign, and that creates issues in sieges. Either lower their tier or give us an option to break down walls. Maybe if we have Frost Maiden, they can have an ability like Shatterstone. It's literally something that Warriors of Chaos have. Maybe something like that could be a benefit. Maybe something for the supporter system. Literally, like, if you gave me something in the supporter system that literally gave me Shatterstone for Kislev, like as opposed to, say, security subsidies, for instance, or, you know, the hero access success chance, I would take that. I would take Shatterstone over here. Even over one Frost Maiden capacity, that would be a really, really good situation to have. So just that kind of siege dynamic. There's a whole discussion on the subject of sieges in general to be had for Warhammer 3. So some aspects over there, balancing wise, like I imagine there's a bunch of things that could be changed in a research tree as well. I would also like more uniqueness. So either faction mechanics or uniqueness in the research tree. Like Asanka has a bunch of things that are unique to her in her research tree. I think it would be great if Boris, Kastaltin, and Katrin also had their own unique aspects over here in terms of the research tree. Or, since I'm not really fond of the research tree, some kind of unique mechanic as well. I do really appreciate the improved Ice Court mechanic, by the way. The training is significantly better. People will say, oh, it's boring because the randomization is removed. That's literally the argument Legend made. And I couldn't disagree with that more. The reason I disagree with that more is because it basically pushed you in a situation where you would play a campaign in Realms of Chaos, train a bunch of Ice Witches and Frost Maidens with all the positive traits, and then ignore everything else. So it wasn't really choice and consequence over there with that. It's like it was the idea of, it was the myth, if you will, of choice and consequence, but it wasn't actually practical. Now, sure, you can argue that load save character does abuse that, but here's the thing, even if you didn't have load save character, sure, you might recruit 1 or 2 Frost Maidens and Ice Witch Lords early on in the campaign with random traits, but later on you would still always go for those good traits, even if you have to train more and more and more and more of them. So it wasn't a great system. I do greatly appreciate that Creative Assembly did improve on that. I think in terms of balancing, I would have to say that Kislev's economy and their general situation is maybe too front heavy. Now, of course, that's going to inherently happen when you're in a campaign situation with people like Azazel, Archeon, Arbol, etc. Fair enough. But the problem is a lot of the economic modifiers and economic power and really fun units to use militarily are available later on. But by that point, your campaign is long since over. And that's been the case since the launch of Warhammer 3. I know that the endgame problem is an issue in general in Warhammer 3 for everyone, but you can have very diverse campaigns. And to be sure, Kislev does have a diverse roster of units available to them. You have range units, Akshinas, you have magic, you have armor costers, Kislevite warriors, all that kind of stuff. There is variety, but you don't use Ice Guard. You don't bother most of the time with things in this tree. Like, I never recruit Frostworms in a Kislev campaign. The only reason I get Frostworms is because the AI has a tendency of really recruiting a lot of them. But outside of that, I personally never recruit them. So give me more reasons to play around with the fun toy box that you've given me, Creative Assembly. I would greatly appreciate having that available in my campaign. That is my perspective on these kind of subjects. I know, I know there's more things to be said on it, but yeah, just more variety, better balancing, even bug fixing and all that kind of stuff. Maybe wipe the already existing loaded save characters because you can delete the file that has them, but it is a bit annoying, right? Because they preserve the existing characters instead of changing things around, right? With the ones you already had. So you end up with a mess with that situation. Also, the fact that you can use load save characters with the previous traits and get some ridiculous growth benefits and construction cost benefits. Yeah, that's also not especially great, I have to say. But anyway, those are the kind of things I believe that Creative Assembly could do. Beyond that, the question would be, would they add another Kislev campaign or another DLC? Well, I think if they were to add another Kislev campaign, they would need to rework Kislev again, because although the rework, again, is great, it's good, it's really, really good, adding another Kislev campaign, making another Legendary Lord, I find that unlikely. I think that the CA would have to invent a new character, and I think Games Workshop is hesitant to allow them to do that. Like, they already invented a lot for Shadows of Change and for Kislev in general, but I think there's also political reasons behind that. But really, Beyond the new Legendary Lord, what would really be great is if Kislev's geography and territory was changed. Like, I understand there's limits because of the size of Immortal Empires, which is probably why I'd recommend the Old World mod, classic version, if you're looking to really have a fun and engaging Kislev campaign. That would be my point of view on that. But yeah, it's just too small, too condensed. There's some really good power over here, but just because of the geography itself, the small size of Kislev in the game, you don't really feel that you're playing that much of a Kislev campaign because you're not really spending that much time beyond like the first 20 turns in Kislev itself. I mean, yes, technically you can consider territory, you can consider Kislev all the way from here basically to more or less here, because apparently that was the territory, that, or maybe even all the way here. That apparently was part of Kislev in the old world before the Chaos invasion right there. But that admittedly is a bit of a silly aspect in the context of Warhammer 3. See, when you're playing a Karl Franz campaign or an Empire campaign, just because of the sheer size of the Empire, you feel like you're playing an Empire campaign. I understand geographic limits and all that, and changing the entire map of Immortal Empires would be a very tall order. But I do think that the situation should be improved for Kislev. And it wouldn't just affect Kislev, it would affect everyone that has to deal with the campaign in this area of the campaign map. It just feels too small and too condensed. Those are the kind of things I would like to see addressed, but if this is the last kind of update that we get for Kislev, I think we're in a really good spot. To be clear on that, I analyze, I criticize. That doesn't mean I just dislike things. I do absolutely applaud Creative Assembly for actually fixing Kislev. I feel that they should have done it at the launch of Shadows Change, but what we've gotten is very solid. Beyond the balancing, some balancing, I think that that's something they should absolutely do. Costin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more.